Imagine the scene. Christmas Eve, 1895. Soft snowflakes are drifting down onto the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. And beyond those enormous wrought iron gates, an unbelievable feat has just wrapped up. A residence. Yet, labeling Biltmore as merely a residence is akin to dubbing the sea a tiny pool. 250 rooms. Pause and let that register. For comparison, the White House boasts 132 rooms. Biltmore featured almost double that. We're discussing 178,996 square feet of living area. That's more than 4 acres, 4 full acres, all under a single roof. If you'd aim to rest in a fresh bedroom each evening, you'd manage it for over a month without duplication. 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms. And remember, this was 1895, back when the typical American household relied on outhouses. The sheer figures paint a picture of opulence that's tough to grasp. 65 fireplaces, since a single one apparently fell short. 3 kitchens. Yes, 3 distinct kitchens dedicated to meal preparation, an enclosed swimming pool, 70,000 gallons of warmed water. In an era when most folks in the U.S. made do with metal wash basins for baths, plus a bowling lane, a fitness area, and a library capable of housing 10,000 volumes. What elevates these stats to jaw-dropping levels is their context. Biltmore didn't rise in New York City, amid the cluster of Gilded Age estates where such lavishness might fit right in. Nor did it emerge in Newport, Rhode Island, site of the elite's rivalry over lavish summer homes. Instead, this grand estate sprang up amid the rugged peaks of North Carolina in what amounted to untamed frontier. The closest big city lay hours distant by rail. The project spanned 6 years and demanded over 1,000 laborers. Stone experts were imported from Europe, Italy, France, England, since local U.S. artisans lacked the expertise for the ambitious vision. A whole rail line had to be constructed solely to haul supplies to the site. Indiana limestone, by the millions of pounds, traveled hundreds of miles. Marble sourced from Italy, oak from England, tiles from Spain, and the price tag? $6 million back in 1895. In today's dollars, that's easily north of $200 million. To give perspective, that sum could have financed multiple thriving universities or sustained whole communities. Yet one individual opted to erect a single dwelling. Upon its completion, Biltmore became, and still is, the biggest privately held residence in the United States. Not just in 1895, not solely in the Gilded Age. Across the full span of U.S. history, no other private dwelling has surpassed it in scale. The industrial magnates gave it a shot. Today's tech tycoons, with their super yachts and secluded isles, haven't touched it. Biltmore remains unmatched. But the real puzzle? Why construct anything so outrageously vast? Why choose the North Carolina Highlands? And most captivatingly, how has it endured while so many fellow Gilded Age estates have crumbled, been forsaken, or repurposed as exhibits? To unravel these mysteries, we must delve into the visionary behind it. A figure utterly unlike his Vanderbilt kin, one who shunned dominating markets or social circles, one who pursued something rarer still, crafting enduring splendor. George Vanderbilt, the reserved tycoon. Vanderbilt entered the world as American aristocracy on November 14, 1862. But encounter him at a high society gathering, and he might slip right under your radar. As his elder brothers, Cornelius and William, grabbed attention with their corporate maneuvers, and their spouses vied for dominance in Manhattan's salons, George favored quiet studies over executive suites and literature over chit-chat. Shy by nature, fiercely reclusive, he harbored a sharp mind that his more outgoing relatives viewed as odd, even mortifying. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, passed away when George was merely 15, bequeathing a staggering $100 million, worth billions in modern terms. It stood as America's greatest personal wealth then. The elder had forged his dynasty through shipping lines and rail networks, demolishing rivals with cold precision and amassing riches that stunned fellow tycoons. Yet George inherited none of that drive for dominance. As his siblings grew the family's rail holdings, George pursued what the Commodore might deem frivolous. He pursued knowledge, real learning. By his 20s, George conversed fluently in 8 tongues: French, German, Italian, mastered not through formal lessons in drawing rooms, but via prolonged stays across Europe. He tackled classical Greek texts. He immersed himself in art history, design principles, farming techniques, woodland management. His private collection swelled to exceed 23,000 books, rivaling the finest individual libraries in the nation. These weren't mere props purchased for show. George had pored over them, marking insights in various idioms. Amid a clan of powerhouses, George emerged as the thinker. In an era where males gauged achievement measured by the enterprises his relatives dominated, George gauged his existence through the knowledge he grasped, the sights he witnessed, and the lessons he absorbed. His siblings viewed his pursuits as futile. Social writers labeled him odd. Yet George remained unfazed. He possessed vast wealth, far beyond his needs, and he resolved to invest it in pursuits of true significance. During his 20s, George journeyed widely across Europe, not merely as a visitor, but as an eager learner of traditions and heritage. He strolled amid the grand chateaux of France's Loire Valley, Chambord, Chenonceau, Blois, examining their designs, landscapes, and harmony with the surroundings. He explored the rural properties of British aristocrats, noting their oversight of expansive territories. He inspected Italy's palazzos and Germany's castles. Amid these explorations, an idea started to crystallize. Imagine crafting in America a domain that matched Europe's magnificent properties, not an imitation, but a distinctly American creation, blending old-world elegance with new-world drive and ingenuity. A sanctuary of elegance and education, a self-reliant property showcasing cutting-edge farming and woodland management, a residence to shelter his cherished volumes and artworks, an enduring inheritance. In 1888, at the age of 26, George first arrived in Asheville, North Carolina. The upland settlement was gaining fame as a wellness retreat. Its fresh breezes and temperate weather were recommended by physicians for respiratory issues. George's mother, Maria, suffered from frailty, prompting frequent family trips for respite. But George perceived more in those timeless peaks. Perched on a crest gazing over the French Broad River, encircled by the mist-shrouded Blue Ridge Mountains, George experienced a sensation absent from New York's bustling, rivalrous elite. Tranquility, opportunity, room to fashion something remarkable. Much of Asheville's surrounding terrain had been stripped of timber, overworked for crops, and left desolate. It was deemed almost valueless. The millennia-old woods had been felled completely. The earth was barren. By common judgment, it resembled barren ground. George envisioned otherwise. He recognized promise, and he started acquiring. Discreetly, methodically, across multiple years, George gathered his holdings. He negotiated justly with regional cultivators and proprietors, offering fair sums, a practice that astonished those anticipating Vanderbilt entitlement. In time, he controlled 125,000 acres. That's almost 200 square miles, surpassing the size of numerous eastern states. His kin believed he had gone mad. Why claim enormous tracts of worn-out soil in such isolation? George's brothers were snapping up rail lines and financial institutions. Meanwhile, George was purchasing earth in North Carolina. But George understood his plan precisely. He engaged Gifford Pinchot, a youthful woodland specialist trained abroad, to rejuvenate the terrain. They aimed to reseed woodlands, revive waterways, and pioneer scientific forestry in America. The property would flourish anew. And at the heart of this sprawling domain, on that overlook above the French Broad River, George planned his chateau. Not a seasonal retreat like his siblings in Newport, not an urban palace akin to his sister-in-law's on Fifth Avenue. A genuine dwelling, a permanent abode, a spot to dwell amid splendor, wilderness, and wisdom. He enlisted Richard Morris Hunt, America's foremost designer, the creator of the Statue of Liberty's base, and the lavish Newport homes for the Astors and his own brother. When Hunt inquired about the desired architectural style, George replied without pause. French Renaissance chateau, inspired by the Loire Valley gems he had examined, and it needed to accommodate his library, his artistic treasures, and entertain visitors in the grand tradition of European domains. Hunt hesitated at first. The site appeared daunting, excessively isolated and rugged. The ambition of George's scale felt unfeasible, yet George persisted. backed by the means to turn the improbable into reality. Construction commenced in 1889. George was 27, single, childless. He was erecting a 250-room mansion for himself, his volumes, his aspirations. His relatives murmured of his quirks, his squandered riches, his solitary end in a lofty fortress amid dusty tomes and vacant chambers. They couldn't foresee that George's endeavor would eclipse all their inheritances. While their residences faced demolition, auctions, or museum conversions, Biltmore would endure, held by his lineage, flourishing over a century hence. But initially, George needed to construct it, and that task would test him like no other. Music. The French Chateau in North Carolina. When Richard Morris Hunt stood on that ridge, and when Richard Morris Hunt ventured into the North Carolina hills to examine George Vanderbilt's blueprints, he likely figured his patron possessed either genius foresight or utter lunacy, likely a mix of the two. As the pioneering American designer trained at Paris's École des Beaux-Arts, Hunt quickly grasped George's aim to relocate an entire Loire Valley castle smack into the rugged Appalachians. Yet this wouldn't be a whimsical Yankee spin with mere Gallic accents. George craved genuineness. He sought the genuine article. The blueprint Hunt devised drew mainly from three French chateaux, Blois, Chenonceau, and Chambord. The sharply angled rooftops, the elaborate gables, the limestone exterior, all evoking pure French Renaissance flair. Still, Hunt went beyond mere imitation. He modified, refined, and forged a creation that paid tribute to Old World heritage while fulfilling New World aspirations. The home's core axis stretches 780 feet. For scale, that's over 2.5 football fields. The limestone facing, sourced from Indiana quarries, demanded millions of pounds of rock. Every block got shaped, labeled, and shipped via train to Asheville, followed by a custom rail line up to the build site. The accuracy demanded was staggering. Those blocks needed to interlock flawlessly, forming barriers to bear the enormous weight overhead. What truly set Biltmore apart in its era, though, was its interior innovation beneath that medieval-looking shell. George insisted on every 1890s gadget imaginable, electric lighting everywhere, fueled by the property's private dynamo, central heat, an extensive steam network with miles of piping, hot and cold water in all 43 bathrooms, kitchen refrigeration via machinery, fire alerts, an intercom linking staff areas to primary spaces, and yes, several elevators to spare visitors the stair climb. That contrast was intentional. George yearned for antique elegance around him, paired with contemporary ease. A history buff himself, he had no longing for outhouses or chilly nights. Building Biltmore's intricacies outstripped U.S. labor capabilities. Sure, skilled tradespeople existed stateside, but George's grand scheme called for experts unavailable domestically, so he brought them over. Dozens of Italian masons showed up, veterans of cathedrals and palaces, hand-sculpting the limestone shell with its stunning embellishments. French plasterers arrived to craft the opulent interior moldings, ceilings adorned with complex patterns, each formed, fitted, and finished manually. British carvers supplied mastery in etched oak walls. Spanish tilers laid durable flooring meant to endure ages. These overseas specialists resided on-site amid the build, forming a mini global community on the slope. They shared their skills with local crews. In essence, Biltmore evolved into an ad hoc academy for European artistry in America. The build itself proved punishing. Keep in mind, this kicked off in 1889. No heavy machinery or instant lift cranes back then. It all relied on ropes, frameworks, raw muscle, and careful strategy. Winters halted progress somewhat, but never fully. George itched to witness his dream take shape, and the minutiae that George fixated on would baffle today's builders. The dining hall's vaulted roof, soaring 70 feet, braced by hefty steel beams masked as ancient timber. The library's hand-hewn oak overhead, taking months of exacting woodwork. Imported European stained glass, each pane tailored to its spot, plus the mosaic floors, hardware on doors, lamp fittings. George vetted them all personally. His designer Hunt would eventually describe collaborating with George as heavenly torment. Heavenly, thanks to George's refined palate, boundless funds, and real grasp of design. Tormenting, since George rejected anything less than flawless. Imperfect elements got scrapped and restarted. Budget never factored in. Excellence alone mattered. The grounds held equal weight for George. He brought on Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary behind New York's Central Park. Olmsted started doubtful. The terrain was wrecked, worn out from years of shoddy agriculture. But George's dream swayed him. They'd revive it, reshape it, craft landscapes to match Europe's finest. Olmsted plotted a winding 3-mile driveway, unveiling the manor bit by bit to heighten excitement. Closer in, he envisioned structured gardens, an Italian parterre, an enclosed retreat, a landscape of shrubbery gardens, demanding thousands of shrubs, many shipped over from Europe. Deeper into the property, away from the residence, he crafted a productive setting with farms, woodlands, plant nurseries, blending practicality and elegance. The entire domain was planned for complete independence. George sought more than a grand home. He envisioned a thriving farm complex inspired by those he observed abroad. It included dairy operations yielding milk and cheese, fruit groves and grapevines, produce plots, poultry houses, and swine pens. The grounds would sustain both residents and the legion of staff. 6 years, that's the duration required to construct Biltmore. 6 years marked by non-stop building, ongoing enhancements, and layer after layer of intricate features. Expenses climbed relentlessly. When the residence was finally habitable, George had invested $6 million, and that covered only the structure itself, excluding property purchases, woodland management, or agricultural setups. His relatives were appalled. His siblings, shrewd businessmen who gauged achievement by financial returns, failed to grasp George's pursuits. For $6 million, one could acquire whole rail networks, back financial institutions, or pour capital into the surging sectors reshaping the nation. Yet George poured it into rock, cement, and ornate oak linings in a remote spot. Their views held no sway over him, as always. As they erected fortunes vulnerable to economic downturns and shifting markets, George forged something enduring, something stunning, something destined to endure beyond the final rail ties removal. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1895, George first flung open Biltmore House's portals. Kin and companions gathered to witness an impossibility, a flawless French castle perched improbably amid North Carolina's peaks, surpassing any splendor from Newport, New York, or even Continental estates. They toured chambers that left them speechless. And that's where our tale continues. Exploring those extraordinary interiors George devised, venturing into the most opulent areas. Picture yourself as a visitor reaching Biltmore that inaugural Christmas Eve in 1895. You've journeyed by rail from New York, followed by a coach ride along the 3-mile entry path Olmsted laid out. Amid stark winter branches, you spy hints of spires and rooftops. Abruptly, the vista clears, revealing it in full, enormous, unbelievable, stunning. Your coach halts at the main portal. As you alight, even prior to crossing the threshold, astonishment engulfs you. The stone exterior soars 4 levels overhead. Grotesques gaze from the eaves. The entry turret climbs still taller. Though in North Carolina, it feels as if you've been whisked to the Loire Valley. Next, the portals part. Your initial interior encounter, and note, this marks your entryway impression, is the Winter Garden. No drawing room or stately foyer here. Instead, an enclosed conservatory with a glassy vault letting sunlight pour through. Palms, ferns, and rare flora form a lush, wild ambiance. A central fountain murmurs softly. Elaborate tiles pave the ground. You're enclosed, yet it evokes the outdoors. Bewildering, enchanting, unprecedented in any U.S. dwelling. Yet this is merely the start. From the Winter Garden, guides usher you to the dining chamber. Here, descriptions falter. The dining chamber measures 70 feet in length, 42 feet across, and overhead, the vault soars 70 feet high. 70 feet, that rivals a 7-floor edifice within a meal space. Vast 16th-century Flemish wall hangings adorn the sides, each a priceless relic. A trio of hearths, indeed 3 aligned fireplaces, commands one wall's end, spacious enough for a person to step within. The carved oak dining surface accommodates 64 guests, ideal for an intimate gathering. Overhead, the vault exemplifies clever mechanics masked as Gothic artistry. No mere timber supports bear the load, concealed steel girders, sheathed in wood and stucco, feign timeless build. Contemporary tech bolstering visual allure that summed up George's ethos across Biltmore. The banners dangling from above aren't mere ornaments. Authentic military standards from old-world units, some centuries old, grace the space. George amassed them on his journeys. Even the lighting, hulking wrought iron pendants, was bespoke to evoke antiquity while harnessing electricity. One could brighten the whole chamber with a mere toggle, a luxury beyond most households' reach. From the dining chamber, you could proceed to the study. And for bibliophiles, this spot would become your haven. The double-height space houses 10,000 tomes from George's own library. Shelves climb from base to summit in polished walnut. A frescoed overhead portrays legendary tales. Plush seating arranges to harness glow from soaring panes. A marble hearth provides for winter escapes. This wasn't some flashy display of books acquired just to dazzle guests with their sheer volume. Instead, these volumes represented George's personal collection, gathered through decades of journeys and scholarly pursuits. Volumes spanning 8 languages, including first prints and scarce handwritten works. It served as a practical study space for a true intellectual. Adjacent lies the music chamber, but labeling it merely that falls short of its grandeur. More woven wall hangings adorn the space. An organ integrated right into the building's design. Seating positioned to foster those cozy gathering-style performances, the sort of close-knit concerts that old-world nobles had been organizing for ages. George envisioned his residence as a hub for refinement, so he crafted areas tailored for artistic pursuits, melodies, and thoughtful discussions. Next up is the morning dining area, featuring prints by Ulrich Dürer on the walls and a surface laid with bespoke porcelain pieces. The gaming lounge, lined completely in leather from Spain, with intricate sculpted timber and overhead frescoes. Every space stands out uniquely. Each boasts its individual flair and hidden gems. But let's focus on the washrooms, as that's where Biltmore's forward-thinking edge truly emerges. 43 such facilities in 1895, equipped with both warm and cool water flows, European-sourced porcelain setups, warming bars for linens, and mosaic-covered surfaces that still feel cutting-edge now. As many folks across America relied on basic privies, George's visitors enjoyed bathing setups that matched the top luxury stays in Europe. And regarding that cutting-edge opulence, consider the indoor aquatic area, warmed with submerged illumination. A total breakthrough back then. The enclosure mimics an ancient Roman spa, with detailed mosaic designs blanketing all areas, yet it's entirely operational, purifying and tempering 70,000 gallons of liquid. George's gentlemen visitors would take dips there, alongside a nearby fitness space for workouts. Remember, this was 1895, long before wellness routines became trendy, but George stayed steps ahead. Down in the lower level sits a full-scale bowling setup, complete with dedicated lanes, bespoke skittles, and spheres, not just a makeshift corner. Dedicated areas exist for housing and caring for shooting gear. A firearms gallery showcasing hundreds of long guns and scatterguns like prized exhibits, plus wine vaults crafted to preserve thousands of bottles at ideal conditions. The staff living areas, since operating such a vast property demanded a legion of workers, outshone typical U.S. residences of the time. Every worker enjoyed a private cubby, a rarity when shared sleeping spots were the norm for help. Staff had their own eating halls, lounges, and even a dedicated cleaning facility with up-to-date laundering devices. The cooking zones, all 3, were wonders of 19th century innovation. Automated chilling units, fuel-powered cooktops, dual-temperature taps, sophisticated pantry arrangements, and all the essentials for crafting multi-dish spreads for crowds of visitors around the clock. Yet what hits you while exploring these spaces is their warmth. They're no sterile exhibit halls. George intended Biltmore for actual dwelling. Sure, it's awe-inspiring. Sure, it brims with invaluable artworks and pieces. But the seats invite you to linger. The hearths function properly and saw regular use. The sleeping spots beckon restfully. This wasn't a fortress meant to overwhelm. Rather, it was crafted to soothe, to uplift, to offer utmost indulgence amid stunning surroundings. Naturally, savoring this splendor and ease demanded something George couldn't construct from rock and cement: human touch. Plenty of it. A whole concealed team that kept Biltmore humming. And that's a tale unto itself. The Legion of Aids. Every enchanted manor hides a brigade of folks crafting the enchantment. At Biltmore, that brigade peaked at about 80 members, 80 individuals tasked with guaranteeing that George Vanderbilt and his company never pondered the inner workings of a 250-room domain. 80 aides. Pause to absorb that figure. That's a larger staff than plenty of modest enterprises employed. And these weren't folks clocking in and out. They resided on-site in the integrated aid barracks. Their days orbited around sustaining this massive property's seamless flow. Leading this structure was the estate overseer, basically the chief executive of all household affairs. Under that, a tangled network of expert positions, the chief attendant directing all male staff and handling meal service logistics, the chief caretaker leading the female staff and upholding spotless conditions across every area. These roles carried real authority. They recruited and dismissed. They organized timetables. They enforced order in various forms. They managed Biltmore's daily rhythm. Then followed the experts. Personal attendants for women visitors, making sure their fancy gowns stayed pristine, their tresses arranged just so, their desires foreseen. Dressers for men, setting out outfits, filling tubs, buffing footwear to glassy perfection. A lead cook, plus several assistant cooks laboring in those triple kitchens, whipping up dishes that The household at Biltmore demanded a vast array of personnel, often totaling a dozen distinct roles. Scullery helpers handled the gritty tasks of scrubbing, chopping vegetables, and tackling the non-stop dishwashing. Butlers attended to dining service, tidied common areas, greeted visitors at the entrance, and relayed communications across the estate via its innovative call system. Chambermaids tended to sleeping quarters, freshened linens, disposed of waste basins prior to the complete rollout of indoor sanitation, polished surfaces, mopped pathways, tended hearths, and managed scores of chimneys. Washwomen labored in the underground washing facilities, scrubbing fabrics manually. In an establishment of this magnitude, where visitors flowed in and out ceaselessly, the volume of soiled items was overwhelming. Beyond the walls, landscapers, by the score, upkept the intricate landscapes crafted by Olmsted. Stable hands looked after equine and transport needs. Agricultural laborers oversaw milk production, fruit groves, and produced plots. Woodsmen patrolled the sprawling 125-acre woodland, applying G. Ford Pinchot's groundbreaking conservation methods. Staff routines kicked off well before sunrise. Chambermaids rose around 5 a.m. to kindle flames in sleeping areas, ensuring residents awoke to cozy spaces. Culinary teams began even sooner, readying the morning repast. When George descended for the day, the manor had buzzed with labor for hours on end, yet he remained oblivious to it all. Invisibility defined exemplary service. Within Biltmore's confines, the workforce inhabited a parallel realm. They navigated concealed functional passages tucked away behind panels, allowing discreet traversal of the premises. Meals occurred in dedicated lower-level spaces, which, while modest, outshone typical servant quarters elsewhere. By era standards, George compensated his team justly, provided decent lodging, and supplied hearty provisions. Yet the toil was grueling. A chambermaid could traverse miles inside the building daily, ascending steps laden with tools, refreshing space upon space without respite. Kitchen swelter, despite improved airflow systems, proved punishing. Washroom duties strained the body to its limits. Schedules ran 6 days weekly, with rare half-days on Sundays. Existence revolved entirely around accommodating the household and its callers. Rigid ranks and customs governed interactions. Senior staff avoided mingling with juniors. Men and women in service stayed mostly apart. In the presence of owners, silence prevailed unless addressed directly. Gazes averted, personal views or woes unspoken. Duty alone mattered. Excellence meant fading into the background. Still, employment at Biltmore carried an odd aura of distinction. One catered to America's elite in a dwelling of unparalleled grandeur. Expertise gained there bolstered lifelong prospects. Instruction proved intensive, mastering 12-dish banquets, safeguarding invaluable heirlooms, navigating state-of-the-art innovations such as powered illumination and lifts. An endorsement from the chief steward or matron opened doors to premier residences nationwide. Many devoted careers spanning decades to Biltmore, loyally supporting the Vanderbilts. They witnessed George's nuptials, his child's arrival, his passing in sorrow. Though woven into the property's legacy, their identities seldom graced official records. Sustaining this workforce incurred staggering outlays: wages, sustenance, attire, quarters. It mounted quickly. Such burdens contributed to the downfall of numerous Gilded Age domains. Construction proved feasible for the affluent, but perpetual upkeep across years and eras overwhelmed most budgets. Service expenses risked ruin for all but the mightiest estates. George managed it readily, though even Vanderbilt resources felt the pinch. Meanwhile, he invested elsewhere, in timber ventures, crop yields, art collections, literature, and opulent hospitality fitting his domain. Biltmore aimed for autonomy via farming pursuits, yet in truth, expenditures outpaced revenues swiftly. Nonetheless, in the initial phase post-opening, funds appeared inexhaustible. George orchestrated grand soirees and extended retreats enduring weeks. Invitee rosters mirrored Gilded Age luminaries, each admirer the flawless execution of their visit, blind to the legion of aides orchestrating it. George's solitary existence in his immense residence proved temporary. Among early visitors treading Biltmore's corridors stood some of America's notables, each with tales to share. Possessing the nation's grandest, most awe-inspiring abode, drew crowds. And George Vanderbilt, for all his reticence, was Actua indeed. George proved to be a generous entertainer. He envisioned Biltmore as a hub for art and knowledge. To achieve that, he aimed to populate its 250 rooms with captivating individuals. The roster of early visitors at Biltmore resembles a blend of Gilded Age America's elite directory and an intellectual gathering spot. These weren't merely affluent folks arriving to marvel at a fellow tycoon's residence. George intentionally fostered ties with creators, authors, scholars, and influential leaders. He sought lively discussions, mental sparks, and artistic interactions. Edith Wharton graced Biltmore with several stays. That's the celebrated novelist Edith Wharton, eventual Pulitzer winner, whose sharp portrayals of Gilded Age extravagance appeared in works such as The Age of Innocence and The House of Mirth. She and George bonded over their passion for books and old-world traditions. Picture them amid the stunning library, chatting about fresh publications, sparring over critical ideas, maybe even Wharton drawing inspiration for her takedowns of emerging American elite life. Even as a detractor of opulence, she couldn't deny Biltmore's allure. It possessed refinement that eluded many lavish estates of the period. Henry James, a towering figure in American letters, made appearances too. Renowned for intricate tales of U.S. natives clashing with European ways, James found a fitting symbol in Biltmore, a French-style castle amid untamed American lands, helmed by a native striving to outdo the Continentals at their own game. The paradox didn't escape him, yet he admired George's endeavor. This wasn't vulgar Yankee flaunting. It reflected true sophistication. Alice Roosevelt, daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, came as a spirited young lady. Notorious for her rebellious antics, she puffed cigarettes openly, wagered on races, and owned a pet snake dubbed Emily Spinach. She famously quipped, quote, Alice adored Biltmore. Decades on, she recounted tales of splashing in the heated pool, savoring opulent banquets, and marveling at the boldness of erecting such splendor in the hills. John Singer Sargent, perhaps the preeminent portraitist of that time, stayed and worked there. His depictions of high society figures shaped our mental images of the Gilded Age. Entertaining Sargent went beyond mere status. It affirmed artistic merit. George had crafted a legacy deserving capture by such a virtuoso. Yet it wasn't solely refined discourse and elevated pursuits. George organized shooting outings as well. The property's vast 125,000 acres suited them ideally. Affluent gentlemen from New York and farther afield would linger for weeks, pursuing deer, bears, and wild fowl. Evenings brought them back to Biltmore for sumptuous suppers, premium vintages from George's cellars, games of pool and smokes. The armory, showcasing countless firearms as if they were masterpieces, served more than ornamentation. Those pieces saw real action. Holidays shone brightly at Biltmore, especially Christmas. George inaugurated the home on Christmas Eve 1895, establishing Yuletide festivities as a custom. The dining hall glittered with pine wreaths. A towering Yule log, easily 20 feet tall, would rise in prominence. Visitors gathered from distant places, indulging in the festive opulence, lavish feasts, concerts in the music chamber, and maybe group sing-alongs under the glass-enclosed winter conservatory filled the days. George aimed to evoke the cozy, bountiful English manor Christmases from his journeys, rich in cheer and plenty. The household staff toiled extra hard through these occasions, yet they shared in the enchantment. George earned a reputation for handsome holiday gifts and arranging a separate staff party. It was shrewd as well as compassionate. Operating a domain this grand demanded devoted, content employees, and fair treatment proved smart oversight. George welcomed relatives too, although those trips could get tricky. His siblings and their spouses arrived, hauling their rivalrous heirs along. They'd swap observations on superior homes, superior galleries, flashier visitors. George typically triumphed in these quiet rivalries, though he cared less for victory than his kin did. He directed Biltmore for his own fulfillment, not their awe. His mother, Maria Louisa Vanderbilt, came when her condition allowed. She had steadfastly backed George's dream amid family skepticism that he was unhinged. But upon Biltmore's finish, her vitality waned. She passed in 1896, mere months post-opening. George's achievement carried the sting of bereavement. Part of the estate's purpose was her sanctuary from New York's biting colds, yet she scarcely savored it. Scholars and experts dropped by as well. This was the time when prosperous Americans bankrolled institutions, academies, and exploratory ventures. George delved into woodland management, farming culture, and natural sciences were key focuses for him, and he'd often invite specialists to advise on the estate's management. These gatherings went beyond mere socializing. They were practical sessions. George envisioned Biltmore as an exemplary model, proving that eco-friendly logging and contemporary farming could thrive in the American South. The dialogues unfolding in Biltmore's chambers back then are hard to picture fully. Exchanges on books, paintings, governance, research, tales from trips across Europe, and reflections on the swiftly evolving United States nearby, with its booming factories, growing cities, and waves of newcomers. These guests enjoyed the privilege of pondering grand concepts, and George had crafted an ideal setting for such exchanges. Yet, despite the steady stream of guests, the lavish hospitality, and the vibrant energy that animated Biltmore in its initial phase, one element remained absent. George neared his 40th birthday, single and solitary in this vast mansion. His relatives fretted. Social chatter buzzed with guesses. Might the reserved intellectual pass away without a spouse, bequeathing no successor to this remarkable property? Then, a shift occurred. George discovered romance. Edith Stassen Dresser, the figure who preserved it all. Her full name was Edith Stassen Dresser. Their encounter in Paris during 1898 revealed her as his complete opposite. Extroverted amid his reticence, assured in crowds where he shrank back, cosmopolitan and refined through real-world encounters rather than mere reading. At 32, Edith was a widow, boasting flawless societal standing. Her family name, Stassen, linked her to one of New York's most ancient lineages, heirs to the final Dutch leader of New Amsterdam. She had wed a considerably older gentleman, Senator Peter Gerry's father, for a short time before his passing, which secured her financial ease and firm social position. Years of wandering Europe had immersed her in elite society, feeling at home in Paris, London, or Rome alike. George was 40 at their meeting, and reports suggest it was true affection, far from any calculated union or expedient match. Likely for the initial time ever, the bookish inward George connected with another who grasped his essence, who cherished aesthetics and refinement as he did, and who could handle the public duties that drained him. They wed in Paris, come June 1898. It was an intimate affair, quintessentially George. No grand public spectacle, no media frenzy, merely intimate kin and companions. Afterward, they came back to Biltmore united as partners. Abruptly, that colossal residence gained a new role, surpassing its function as an elaborate single-man study. Edith reshaped Biltmore. Not in architecture, the structure stood flawless, but in its social flow and daily workings. George had erected a display piece, yet struggled to inhabit it fully. Edith grasped precisely how to oversee a grand domain. Her upbringing had prepared her through stays at English manor houses, French chateaux, and Italian villas. She knew the ropes of directing household staff, hosting with finesse, and turning a grand edifice into a welcoming haven. Moreover, she recognized an issue George had overlooked. Biltmore was draining funds rapidly. The building expenses had been immense, but upkeep proved even more burdensome. The 80 household workers, the care of 250 chambers, the opulent receptions, the farm ventures still unprofitable, all devoured money swiftly. Even Vanderbilt wealth had limits. Edith introduced understated adjustments, avoiding harsh reductions that might dim the estate's splendor, but applying the prudent oversight George had ignored. She bargained for improved deals from vendors. She streamlined the farming to boost productivity. She trimmed personnel a bit, merging duties to create a more streamlined setup without skimping on quality. George had fashioned Biltmore like an artist sculpting a magnum opus, overlooking the ongoing upkeep demands. Edith added pragmatic insight to balance his creative zeal. Beyond her administrative prowess, though, Edith infused Biltmore with vitality. Just a year into wedlock, she conceived. On August 22, 1900, Cornelius Stent Vanderbilt arrived at Biltmore. At last, the vacant children's quarters found their calling. The property now boasted a successor. George, 42 then, became a parent. Cornelius's early years in Biltmore surely proved remarkable. Picture maturing in America's biggest residence, with 250 chambers for discovery and 125,000 acres as one's playground. He enjoyed a personal pony, private tutors, and dedicated living quarters. Yet Edith resolved that Cornelius avoid indulgence from such advantages. She emphasized structure, learning, and the notion that such status demanded accountability. For George, the period following his nuptials likely marked his most joyful stretch. He possessed his cherished residence, his book collection, his woodlands and landscapes. He shared it with a spouse who comprehended him and a child he treasured. He pressed on with his academic interests, acquiring artworks and testing woodland management. Biltmore had become precisely what he'd envisioned. It turned out just as he'd envisioned, a true family residence, far more than a mere grand estate. Yet the harsh twist of the Gilded Age lay in this truth. You might construct an extraordinary edifice, but true lasting legacy eluded your grasp. George's constitution, always delicate, started to deteriorate. He'd long favored scholarly pursuits over strenuous exercise, his frame never particularly sturdy. In 1914, he faced an urgent appendectomy in Washington, D.C. What ought to have been a straightforward procedure turned problematic. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II perished right there on the surgical table, aged only 51. He had savored just 16 years within the home he'd devoted 6 years to erecting, 16 years to relish his masterpiece. His marriage had lasted a mere 14 years. Daughter Cornelia was merely 13. Overnight, Edith found herself isolated once more, widowed for the second time, left with a teenage girl in America's grandest private residence to uphold. The property continued bleeding money. Though farming efforts had advanced, they fell short of covering costs. World War I loomed on the European horizon, reshaping finances everywhere. The Gilded Age was fading, taking with it the lavish times when one could effortlessly sustain a 250-room mansion staffed by 80 attendants. Edith might have offloaded Biltmore, plenty anticipated she would. Fellow Gilded Age clans were already deserting their sprawling domains. Expenses had grown impossible to bear. The Vanderbilts' New York palaces were hitting the market or facing the wrecking ball. Newport's summer retreat stood empty and neglected. Selling would have made perfect sense. But Edith cherished George deeply and grasped Biltmore's profound significance to him. This went beyond a dwelling. It embodied his enduring vision, a testament to America's potential, elegant, refined, self-sufficient. It was where their child had entered the world and thrived. Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. Vanderbilt wasn't one to surrender without a fight. She resolved on a path that stunned high society and ultimately preserved Biltmore. She vowed to defend it at any cost, and those costs would demand every bit of her wit, resolve, and bravery, for the toughest trials lay in wait. A child, a loss, and a globe engulfed in conflict. The very year of George's passing, 1914, marked a pivotal shift for humanity. That summer, mere months after his demise, World War I erupted across Europe. The traditional ways George had admired, the refined European heritage that shaped Biltmore, shattered under the roar of rifles and cannons. In North Carolina, Edith confronted her private struggles. At 49, widowed with a 13-year-old daughter and a domain teetering on financial ruin, she pressed on. George's inherited wealth provided a solid base, no doubt, yet Biltmore devoured funds at an alarming pace, and Europe's turmoil only intensified the pressure. Edith's initial move was to seize full authority. George had overseen Biltmore with enthusiasm, and by entrusting tasks to others, Edith dove into the minutiae. She pored over ledgers, scrutinized each outlay, insisted on streamlined processes across the board. The employees, used to George's mild intellectual guidance, now reported to a sharp-eyed matriarch who missed nothing. She enacted tough measures. Headcount shrank incrementally, without fanfare. Unused chambers were sealed, slashing fuel and upkeep bills. Social gatherings dwindled. Farm activities grew and were updated. For Biltmore to endure, it had to produce revenue, not merely drain it. Yet the greater hurdle was Cornelia, a young teen maturing in the nation's biggest abode, fatherless now, under a mother torn between sorrow and the battle to secure their sanctuary. Cornelia's early learning came from in-house instructors, cocooned from broader realities. Edith then chose boldly once more. Cornelia would study away from Biltmore. Exposure to everyday existence mattered more than the insulated splendor of their mountaintop retreat. She enrolled in a New York institution, stayed with kin, tasted independence outside the grounds. The transition jarred her. The once pampered girl, served hand and foot, now maneuvered crowded subways and teeming avenues. But Edith's instinct proved sound. Cornelia required readiness for a swiftly evolving era. When the U.S. joined World War I in 1917, Biltmore could no longer stand apart. The grounds aided the cause, yielding crops for troops and staging events to sell Liberty bonds. Several young male workers signed up. The Gilded Age's opulent soirees and idle elite suddenly appeared trivial amid worldwide strife. The 1920s ushered in fresh obstacles. Peace had returned, but the nation had transformed. The robber baron epic was conclusively over. What was once a negligible income levy now surged. Inheritance duties emerged, burdening the transfer of vast wealth to heirs. The elite circles that had once celebrated estates like Biltmore began to feel ashamed of their opulence during that era. This marked the Jazz Age, swift, contemporary, and city-focused. Rural retreats appeared outdated. Additional Vanderbilt holdings were auctioned off. The enormous Fifth Avenue residences in New York got torn down to clear space for business developments. Many of the Newport cottages shut down for good, their upkeep proving too costly. The Breakers, the Vanderbilt's premier Newport property, exceeded Biltmore in size but was turning into a heavy financial strain for its proprietors. Edith observed these developments and realized Biltmore faced the same fate without bold action. The property continued running in the red. Cornelia had grown up by then. She wed in 1924 during an extravagant event at Biltmore and held her own visions for the site's destiny. Tensions were building. Then arrived 1929, with the stock market collapse signaling the onset of the Great Depression. Overnight, the issue shifted from merely sustaining a sprawling property to sheer endurance. Wealth that once appeared endless evaporated in moments. Financial institutions crumbled, companies folded. Affluent households suddenly grappled with hardship. Though the Vanderbilt wealth remained considerable, it wasn't impervious. Assets plummeted in worth, revenue plummeted, and Biltmore, burdened by its enormous running expenses, grew impossible to uphold in its classic manner. Alterations were essential, or all that George had created risked vanishing. At 64, Edith had devoted 15 years to sustaining Biltmore's vitality. Now she confronted the toughest choice of her existence, one that would appall George, outrage the surviving remnants of Gilded Age high society, yet ultimately preserve it all. In 1930, Edith Vanderbilt welcomed paying visitors to Biltmore House. The family continued residing there, so it wasn't positioned as a museum, but rather as a draw. For $1, guests could explore the main-level chambers. They strolled the dining hall where U.S. presidents had feasted. They admired the vast library stocked with countless volumes. They caught a sense of how the elite once dwelled amid the Gilded Age splendor. High society reeled in disbelief. Admitting outsiders into one's personal residence and levying an entry fee struck as outrageous. It smacked of vulgarity. It smacked of trade. It contradicted every principle the Vanderbilts allegedly embodied: secrecy, elitism, and noble scorn for business dealings. Yet Edith dismissed societal judgments. She always had. Her goal was rescuing Biltmore. And if that required inviting in sightseers, then that's what she'd do. George would get it, she assured herself. He'd crafted Biltmore as a pinnacle of beauty, an exemplar for U.S. manor houses. Today, it would fulfill a fresh role, revealing to everyday citizens a glimpse of the exceptional. Astonishingly, triumphantly, the strategy succeeded, unlocking the gates to the public. Those initial visitors crossing Biltmore's threshold in 1930 likely sensed they'd entered a parallel realm. Keep in mind, this unfolded amid the Depression. Lenders were toppling, folks were forfeiting their dwellings, joblessness surged. Yet amid the Blue Ridge peaks stood this grand edifice, a holdover from a time of boundless riches, beckoning entrance for merely $1. Crowds materialized in notable volume, not overwhelming throngs, the economic woes curbed journeys, but sufficient. Individuals who'd never fancied entering a Vanderbilt abode now tread the very paths once graced by leaders and writers. They lingered in the soaring 70-foot banquet chamber. They marveled at irreplaceable woven hangings and masterpieces. For a brief spell, they could envision belonging to that bygone Gilded Age realm. Still, this differed from a sterile gallery visit. The Vanderbilts inhabited Biltmore ongoing. Edith and Cornelia maintained secluded areas off-limits to guests, yet they dwelled there actively. On occasion, sightseers might spot them. The dynamic must have felt odd for everyone involved, the visitors beholding the elite in their element, the Vanderbilts enduring intruders in their sanctuary. Tourism revenue offered relief, though it fell short of covering the full property's needs. Edith tackled further tough calls. By 1932, she offloaded a major swath of the land, roughly 86,000 acres, to the U.S. government. That territory joined Pisgah National Forest, among the earliest such preserves in the East. Poetically, it aligned. George had innovated methodical woodland management there, alongside G. Ford Pinchot. Now, it stood safeguarded for generations. The transaction injected vital funds, aiding Biltmore through the Depression's darkest phase. However, it shrank the domain dramatically, reducing it to around 8,000 acres from the initial 125,000. The ambitious dream of an expansive, independent haven yielded to protect the core residents. World War II introduced fresh trials and prospects. Biltmore's isolated fortified mountain perch turned it into a refuge for invaluable artworks. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., anxious over potential strikes on the city, relocated numerous treasures there for safekeeping. Canvases valued at millions, iconic creations that nowadays would. Those invaluable pieces, had they been auctioned off, would have brought fortunes. Instead, they were crafted and preserved in Biltmore's music room, along with other areas. For multiple years amid the conflict, Biltmore safeguarded a greater trove of significant artwork than nearly all global museums. Visitor numbers during wartime remained sparse. Fuel shortages curtailed travel, and folks grappled with weightier issues. Yet Edith, approaching her 8th decade, persisted in overseeing the property with the unyielding resolve that had defined her for generations. She had steered Biltmore through the economic downturn of the 1930s. She had weathered the turmoil of global strife. Cornelia's path diverged sharply. Her union dissolved in the 30s. Following the split, she departed Biltmore, dividing her days between Europe and New York. The heir to such opulence discovered it restrictive. She craved independence, unburdened by the duty of upholding her father's enduring heritage. It fell to Edith, the outsider who had wed into the lineage, to shoulder that weight. Edith passed away in 1958, reaching 92 years old. She had endured 44 years beyond George's time. Almost 50 years were devoted to defending his creation. Upon her passing, Biltmore endured, under family ownership, actively functioning. Defying improbable challenges, enduring financial crises and societal shifts that felled fellow Gilded Age properties, Biltmore persisted. Yet endurance exacted a toll. The grounds had shrunk. It welcomed sightseers. The kin no longer resided there in the traditional full-time manner. The domain had transformed into a commercial venture as much as a residence. The era of domestic staff and lavish soirees had vanished. The Gilded Age had conclusively faded. Nevertheless, Edith achieved an extraordinary feat. As Vanderbilt's New York residences were razed, as Newport's summer homes turned into exhibits or lodgings, as other grand U.S. domains decayed or changed hands, Biltmore stayed within the family's grasp, scarred and scaled back, yet vital. The pressing inquiry then became, could the succeeding heirs replicate Edith's tenacity? Could they recalibrate once more to America's evolving landscape? For by the 1960s and 1970s, sustaining even a pared-down Biltmore grew ever more arduous. Inheritance levies, land assessments, upkeep expenses, they pressed on relentlessly. Tourist revenues provided aid, but sufficed it? Following Edith's demise, George's grandson, William A. Cecil, assumed control of Biltmore. He confronted a dilemma unfamiliar to prior stewards. Ought the lineage relinquish and divest at last? Or might Biltmore reinvent itself anew, carving out endurance in contemporary U.S. society? The ensuing developments would decide if George's dream would extend to the 21st century, or if Biltmore would ultimately rest among the Gilded Age's lost relics. Biltmore in the present day, the improbable endurance. Position yourself at Biltmore's gateway now and witness an anomaly that defies reason. A thriving, family-held Gilded Age manor, 130 years post-construction. By rational standards and past patterns, such longevity seems unattainable. Reflect on the fates of comparable U.S. treasures. The Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue dwellings in New York, torn down in the 1920s and 1930s, supplanted by office structures. The breakers in Newport, grander and more ornate than countless European chateaux, transferred to the Preservation Society in 1972 as upkeep proved unaffordable for the owners. The Marble House, likewise in Newport, repurposed as a public exhibit. Whitehall, Henry Flagler's Florida residence, now a museum. Examples abound, raised, gifted, marketed, repurposed. But Biltmore stands apart. Biltmore remains under the stewardship of George Vanderbilt's lineage, managed as a familial enterprise, and in various respects functions as a personal abode, albeit one hosting over 1 million guests annually. How does such persistence occur? It stems from relentless, innovative, at times grueling adjustment to shifting eras. William Cecil, George's grandson, who assumed leadership in the 1960s, recognized that visitor fees alone fell short. Diversified income sources were essential for viability. Thus, he pursued measured strategic growth. A vineyard took root on the premises. Nowadays, Biltmore Estate Winery ranks among America's top attractions, crafting acclaimed vintages through time-honored techniques that George himself might have valued. An upscale lodging facility arose on the estate, not within the manor, but amid its landscapes. The inn on Biltmore Estate lets visitors immerse in the site, awakening to the very mountain vistas that captivated George in 1888. This premier hospitality yields substantial returns without compromising the residence's authenticity. Dining venues emerged, alongside retail outlets, themed gatherings, performances, holiday festivities, and floral displays in the spring gardens. Biltmore evolved into a multifaceted haven beyond mere guided tours. Guests arrive for nuptials, business functions, vintner samplings, and explorations across the surviving 8,000 acres. The manor proper undergoes painstaking conservation and, in spots, enhancements surpassing its inaugural splendor. Advanced environmental systems shield the collections and decor. Safety mechanisms guard against calamities. The ongoing care. The workforce at Biltmore, while reduced from the 80 attendants of George's era, remains dedicated throughout the year to safeguarding every aspect. The spaces that visitors explore now closely resemble their appearance back in 1895. The grand dining area continues to impress with its splendor. The study retains thousands of volumes, including numerous from George's personal assortment. The conservatory thrives with rare flora. The swimming facility, the 10-pin lounge, the sleeping quarters, all meticulously upkept as tributes to the era's ornate artistry. Yet, what elevates Biltmore in contemporary times is its vitality beyond stasis. The Vanderbilt lineage occupies secluded sections of the property. Today's heirs, descendants several generations removed from George, actively participate in managing the grounds. This isn't a detached exhibit overseen by trustees. It's a hereditary enterprise, handed down with its inherent challenges and obligations. The financial framework, intricate yet effective, relies on varied income flows. Sightseeing forms the core funding stream. Over 1 million guests each year contribute entry fees that offset most upkeep expenses. The vineyard yields strong returns. Lodging and dining options produce earnings. Business gatherings and nuptials command hefty charges. Collectively, these multifaceted sources achieve the once unthinkable fiscal viability for Biltmore. Nevertheless, obstacles persist. Levies on 8,000 acres and an invaluable residence add up considerably. Upkeep demands are perpetual. For a structure so aged and vast, repairs are ongoing. Workforce expenses, coverage, energy bills, the everyday burdens of sustaining what amounts to a compact community. Inheritance duties loom as a risk across generations. The kin must strategize far ahead to transfer the property intact to successors without liquidation for fiscal obligations. Still, they've navigated it all. Enduring economic slumps and conflicts, societal shifts that rendered Gilded Age domains extravagant, legislation aimed at dismantling vast holdings, downturns in prosperity, and evolving travel habits. Biltmore endures where parallels have faded. Imagine George's reaction to today's Biltmore. He'd likely be stunned by crowds traversing his sanctuary, now captured in countless snapshots by outsiders. He envisioned it as an exclusive haven. Yet, he'd marvel at the enduring fascination, the eagerness of Americans to witness his masterpiece. Above all, he'd acknowledge his enduring blueprint. The residence gleams with impeccable care. The woodland he labored to revive persists. The domain exemplifies blending elegance with endurance. His study, his artworks, his aspiration for permanence, they all endure. And crucially, Biltmore continues to captivate. That 1 million yearly guests arrive not merely to marvel at opulence, they seek evidence of ambition backed by resources brought to life. They admire artistry lost to time. They stroll amid a historical artifact that pulses with relevance. Biltmore endures as a singular chapter in U.S. heritage, a Gilded Age palace that outlasted its birthplace. Not flawlessly, not unaltered, but resilient, evolved, flourishing. It's a testament to George's foresight, undeniably, but also to Edith's resolve, William Cecil's savvy in commerce, and each lineage's choice to safeguard over monetize. The era's grandest residence transformed into an emblem George hadn't foreseen, one of safeguarding American treasures, of enduring viability, of enduring kinship. It persists because every era altered all but the essential ideal. Upholding grace, cherishing artistry, affirming that certain legacies merit defense. Gazing upon Biltmore now, with its French-inspired turret crowning the North Carolina highlands in defiance of logic, you behold more than architecture. You witness validation that ambition, grit, and perpetual evolution can sustain even the wildest aspirations. George crafted Biltmore for eternity. Defying expectations, it has. And with the clan's ongoing guardianship, it will endure for ages to come. The nation's premier manor, held by its founding kin, still igniting wonder in all who enter.